My name's Kelly. I'm the Head of Knowledge Exchange Development and Evaluation at the other university in Nottingham, at Nottingham Trent University. And I hope you are all here to find out about evaluating knowledge exchange. So I'm not going to talk for very long because nobody's here to listen to me, but I think about evaluation quite a lot. It's in my job title. So how do you evaluate knowledge exchange is something that sometimes keeps me awake at night. And I'm hoping that these presentations are going to give us some clues, hints and tips. So whether or not you are an expert or a complete newbie to evaluation, this afternoon's sessions are going to enlighten you, and hopefully you will take something away that you can try out in your own context. So, up first, I'm not going to do long introductions, I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. So, coming up first is Hilary from the University of Exeter.
Well, how lovely. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Hilary, and I'm the Monitoring and Evaluation Lead for Impact Innovation and Business, the Professional Services Division responsible for knowledge exchange at the University of Exeter. So, my session is going to focus on the practical project and programme evaluation, and specifically sharing some of the lessons that I've learned over the years. I won't share with you how many, because that's just too embarrassing. Some of these lessons are drawn from designing and delivering evaluations on behalf of the university itself, and some of them are drawn from consultancy that we have delivered through Marchmont Observatory, so consultancy that we've delivered on behalf of others. At the end, it would be lovely if you could share some of your own experiences. That's part of the reason why I'm here, is to learn by sharing some of my experiences to learn from some of yours. So I would be really delighted to hear what you've been doing. But equally, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. But before I start, I just want to briefly introduce how we are approaching evaluation of knowledge exchange at Exeter. I'm really keen to find out how other institutions are approaching this. So do catch up with me afterwards at some point in the conference, because I'd be delighted to have a conversation about how you are doing things. I'll also share with you just a few examples of the types of projects from which our lessons are drawn. So firstly, our approach to the evaluation of knowledge exchange is still in its infancy. We've formalised our approach, so we now have an evaluation function, which essentially is me. The Concordat has provided the stimulus for this, with its emphasis on building capacity and capability in both evidencing our success and continuously to improve the design and delivery of our support. So we now have a function, we have a draft evaluation framework, and we have a work plan consisting of the elements on the slide. Given where we are in our business planning cycle, a lot of this early work has centred on building the evidence base for our business engagement strategy. So we're now moving on to think more deeply around monitoring and how we embed a culture of evaluation and continuous improvement, and thinking about how we evidence impact. So it's definitely kind of work in progress. Right. So the next couple of slides highlight some of the projects that we have been delivering over the years, and the way that I've categorised them may help you to think about and differentiate between different kinds of your own evaluation. So Michael Quinn Patton, you may know, is an American evaluator, and he differentiates between three types of purposes for evaluation. And the first is for kind of rendering judgments. These judgment-orientated evaluations answer questions such as how effective has this been, and did the programme work? The kind of questions that you'll probably be familiar with when you're trying to demonstrate the accountability of your projects and demonstrate the value for money to your funders. We've evaluated a few of these kinds of projects. We evaluated several rounds of the Union Learning Fund, some on our own and some in partnership with the University of Leeds. I mean, the fate of that programme demonstrates that decisions around continued funding don't just rely on evaluation. There's a kind of a policy kind of imperative there as well, as unfortunately that fund can no longer exist. We've also evaluated a number of our own kind of ESIF programmes. We had about 11, we led 11 in Devon and Cornwall. And we were involved in commissioning and delivering some internal aspects of that ourselves. The second primary purpose of evaluation is to facilitate improvements. Now, these are the kind of evaluations that I kind of love most, because it means I can get out and talk to people about how things are working for them in terms of the design and the delivery of programmes. And you really get a good sense of how things are working in the field. And this is where I've seen most kind of instrumental use of evaluation, and it's kind of often the most rewarding. Finally, we have knowledge-orientated evaluations. Now, these are often commissioned as part of like a demonstrator project or a pilot, but the findings are meant to inform thinking kind of generally around the development of programmes or knowledge, and so they can be generalised findings can be generalised to other contexts. I mean, we've recently completed an evaluation of student exchange programme funded by the Office for Students and delivered in partnership with the Universities of Bristol, Bath and Surrey, as well as ourselves. So these are really useful for examining kind of what works. So understanding how evaluation findings will be used and by whom will help shape the scope and focus of your evaluation and help you select the most appropriate methods. You'd be glad to know I'm not going to go through each of these and just tell you what each of these types of evaluations are, but it's just to bring this up to you to show you that there are different forms and types of evaluation for different purposes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about hypothetical, like deductive approaches to evaluation. Now that is those that are designed to test a theory or an achievement of an intended set of outcomes. I'm going to talk about those in a minute, but I think it's fair to say that most evaluations take that kind of form. However, I think it's actually fair to acknowledge that there are inductive approaches or goal-free evaluations where I think don't perhaps receive the kind of attention that they deserve. So this is where an evaluation where the evaluator doesn't have any prior knowledge about what the programme is designed to do, but goes out and talks to programme participants about what the outcomes have been for them. So, which is a really kind of novel approach and something that I think is rather quite interesting. So this point is about remaining with this idea about audience, is that a value is often commissioned as a condition of funding, and therefore it's natural to want to meet their kind of needs and consider them primarily the audience for evaluation findings. However, there are often other audiences as well, and you really do need to bear those in mind. For example, where there's a fixed term project, there's likely to be an internal desire for evidence to demonstrate the success of that programme so that they can look for other funding. So whilst evaluation can be seen as a bit of a tick box exercise, or we have to do it because funder wants it, actually engage with the project delivery staff, because they will actually find that information really useful too, and you can extend the funders' requirements to incorporate other elements that they will need later. So we start to talk a little bit about kind of methodology here, but not in too much detail, so don't worry. I mean, ideally, when we're looking at impact evaluation, this involves a two-step process. So first of all, you need to accurately measure the change that has occurred during the project, and then construct a counterfactual where you can disentangle the impact of the project from all of the other factors. I mean, sounds easy, huh? Well, no, not really. So this is when kind of reality bites. All sounds great in theory. I mean, firstly, just measuring change can be really difficult. For example, the ESIF guidance that we read meticulously in developing the evaluations of our ESIF projects kind of recommended identifying beneficiaries in administrative data sets, such as the IDBR, which is fine if you're in a government department, but actually I've tried several times to access this disclosive data as a university employee with no success. Now, if anyone's got any tips on how you can do that, I'd be really all ears. So even identifying beneficiaries in administrative data sets can be problematic. So you normally have to go back to source, so go to the source, to the beneficiaries themselves and ask them, and I'll just say a little bit more about that in a minute. Establishing the counterfactual is where it gets kind of really tricky. Often projects are not designed as randomised controlled trials. That's just not the kind of game that we're in. It just doesn't seem to happen in our area of work. It's methodically quite tricky, and how do you set those things up? But there are innovative ways that you can set up quasi-experimental methods. So it can be done, and it is often done for national programmes. For the kind of projects that we engage in locally, it takes a bit of time, it takes a bit of expertise, and that inevitably means it takes a little bit of money. So often it's just not practical. You might want to do it, but it's not often, you just don't have the time or money. So unsurprisingly, therefore, self-reported methods are the most practical but least robust means of establishing a counterfactual. I mean, we've approached this by asking beneficiaries how important the support has been in generating the stated outcomes and the extent to which these outcomes would have happened anyway, and then using these estimates to adjust the outcomes that have been reported. But that's just one approach. The other approach is kind of theory-based, is to talk about the contribution that a project makes. Now, this involves taking a logic model that I know another presenter is going to talk about in a minute, that sets out the various components of the project, but makes explicit the assumptions that link those elements of the logic chain. Then the evaluation should then seek to test those assumptions, and if you can demonstrate that your intervention has linked those changes, then you can demonstrate that you've made a contribution. Sometimes the theory of change and logic models are just used interchangeably, but they are two quite different things. So I've got a couple of examples, really quick examples of some kind of frameworks and theories that we've used in the past as part of our evaluations that you may find kind of useful, or you may have even used yourselves before. I mean, the Kirkpatrick model it's been around since 1959, actually, so it's been around a while, but it was reviewed in 2016 by Donald Kirkpatrick's son and daughter-in-law, who've kind of taken on the family business. Now, this has been used a lot. You'll encounter it all the time, and it's used to evaluate training, and it has 4 levels. So first of all, you ask beneficiaries how they felt about the training, what they learnt from it, how they utilised the training at work, and then how the organisation benefited from the implementation of this training. And it all seems quite kind of logical. But it has been criticised for being a bit oversimple. It doesn't take account the myriad of other factors that might influence, for example, what people learn, how they implement it, and the ability of the organisation to use that learning for kind of commercial success. We've also used Aizen's theory of planned behaviour, and we use this to develop an evaluation strategy for our student startup programme. And according to this theory, there are 2 precedents to starting up a venture. Firstly, you've got to want to do it, which seems fair enough. It's got to be desirable to you. And then secondly, you've got to believe that you can do it. So we developed some questionnaires and a theory that explored their intent to start up a business, and whether they believed it would give them the lifestyle they want, whether the family and their friends were supportive, and whether they believed that they can do it. So this kind of provides you with the kind of structure in which you can go ahead and kind of gather data and put your argument together. And then finally, just the third one, this is an evaluation framework that we used. It was developed by Maurice Atkinson a few years ago now, but it was a framework that we used to assess partnership working for an interim evaluation of the SWOOP project. So that that explores the effectiveness of a partnership in terms of 6 major factors: the vision and leadership, the partnership dynamics, strategy and performance management, cost effectiveness, and participation and influencing. So we just developed some measures around each of those headings and explored the extent to which the members of the partnership felt that the partnership was working on each of these things. And there are numerous theories and frameworks out there, and I recommend you certainly kind of going out and finding the ones that suit your needs. So now we're going to get quite practical again, drawing on some of the challenges in gathering primary data. And first is focusing on 10 minutes, focusing on surveys, which we've done quite a lot of. I mean, my sense is, and I don't know whether you will agree with me, that actually it's actually more difficult to get people to complete surveys. And I don't know whether it's because we just see so many of them now. You don't have to buy anything really before somebody sends you a survey saying, did your courier deliver your parcel effectively, or invited to give feedback on everything, and you kind of become quite numb and to the whole process and less willing to contribute. So we've had to work pretty hard to get feedback from even companies that we have supported through our European programmes. And we found that one of the ways to do that is to actually embed that data gathering within the kind of delivery process, or make it a condition of them getting some support. So if you can get your project staff involved in gathering that data whilst they've got the beneficiary in front of them, then that kind of helps. But it's certainly got harder. And developing questionnaires is an art form. I mean, I would say this. The questions need to be concisely expressed, eliminate any arbitrariness in any of the concepts. They need to follow an order, not be biased. And balanced Likert scales are a particular hate of mine, and I see it quite a lot of the time. Open-ended questions are really useful, but respondents often don't like giving a lot of information, and we'll just skip them unless there's something they feel really strongly about. And you need to make sure that you've got the time and the capacity to analyse all that data that you've collected. We received 37,000 responses to a Unison survey, a survey of Unison members we did once, and you certainly need time and tools to process all that information. We struggle to capture information, particularly on kind of commercial aspects, so things like change in turnover, and whether you ask for a specific amount or invite the respondent to tick a band. But that just seems to be something that businesses find quite difficult to answer or even want to. Online surveys are very cheap, but response rates are typically quite low. We find that using specialist survey software can help. It creates a more professional impression. It can help with survey management, automating, sending out the invitations, and reminders, kind of automatic routing through the questionnaire. You can pre-populate responses as well for the respondent to kind of check. These emails often get sent from the software developer's server, not yours, so they can end up in respondent's junk email, which is something to watch out for, which was a bit of a shock that we encountered once. So face-to-face surveys are great for developing a nuanced understanding about how a programme is working, and I find this particularly powerful if it's conducted at an interim stage, as this generates feedback that the project team can incorporate into the programme. We've heard a little thing about this earlier, about this opportunity to pause and reflect. I mean, ideally the evaluator is a trusted individual from outside the delivery team, but not necessarily outside of the institution, and self-reflection and self-assessment can work as well. So it doesn't have to be kind of externally commissioned. And one of the things that I've learned is I've conducted interim evaluations, and I faithfully reported kind of all of the issues to try and give as much detail as I possibly could about how the project was working. But in reflecting on my own practice, I think some prioritisation is probably helpful. So asking staff what the most pressing or most impactful issues was, so that the response could kind of be prioritised, so it's just not a big list of problems. I've done interviews mostly on a one-to-one basis, and that does work really well. But actually we did a group interview recently, and one member of staff, who was perhaps the most experienced and the most vocal, was concerned that maybe that they were kind of dominating the discussion. But actually, it was really important for other members of the team to hear what he was saying, because they were kind of challenges in the project. So that kind of underscored that the process of engaging in evaluation can be as important as the outcome. I probably need to speed up now, since I've only got 5 minutes. Okay, just a couple more slides. So timing. Timing is everything. On the one hand, you want to push back as late as you dare in order to gather as much information about the impacts as possible for the funder. But on the other hand, you want to deliver that information in a timely way, so that the project team, you want to deliver it before the project team have packed up and the project is closed, in case there is a chance for continued funding. This chart underlies the point that timing is one of the main barriers cited by analysts in central government that prevents evaluation use. So timing is really important. And then finally, resources. I've yet to encounter a generous evaluation budget, but I will keep looking. And these are only usually allocated as a condition of funding. Funders can vary hugely in their expectations, and these can be unrealistic, and pragmatism is the name of the game. You can't do everything. You need to consider what can be delivered using existing internal resources. It's always a good idea to get senior level buy-in into the evaluation process, particularly if you want to have impact. But on a practical level, the project administrator is your best friend. If you gain their commitment and cooperation early, you can get better access to the monitoring data, and it will make your life much easier. And finally, the last tip really is probably will need to commission some elements of the evaluation externally at some point. So do cultivate a network of trusted associates. Thank you very much, everyone. Oh, right. Time for one question. I can't actually, hang on, take my, can't see.
Have you got anything clever to say about how you
No.
capture that? I know you have. Like that dead weight, you know, the things that are going to happen anyway. You know, we're all interested in, you know, creating impact and seeing that. We know it takes place over a long time. We know there are many, many other parties associated with that. How do we, you know, your clever ways of really defining what it is that
I don't know whether
we
they're
bring.
that clever really, but we have developed a couple of kind of core questions that we use in our employer surveys, and we attempt to ask, you know, whether the outcomes would have happened anyway, to what extent they would have happened. So would they have happened anyway? Would they have happened quicker? Is it better quality? So we have different ways. We do have a question like that, and then we attempt to look at displacement and substitution as well. So to what extent their markets are locally, to what extent the additional revenue that they have generated might have displaced that of other companies. I mean, it's all good intentioned, so we do try, but it's a question of, you know, getting those responses. But there are kind of national surveys, there are national estimates of, you know, the multiplier effects and displacement and stuff, so that you can, of similar programs, so you can kind of look at your own and see whether they make much sense in comparison to the other types. So we do try. I'm not saying we've got it completely right. I don't know if anyone has. I mean, I've seen some guidance on, you know, good practice in asking business questions. I think it was from Biz or whatever, and I didn't like them. I didn't think the questionnaire worked particularly well. But they're the experts. No, I don't mind the Likert scales. They're lovely. Some people they don't understand them. So unless they're researchers, they will make them unbalanced, or they'll have categories that aren't scales. So there's one. I can't think of an example now. You put me on the spot. Sorry. But they're just unbalanced and they're biased, and it just drives me completely mad.
Thank you. Thanks.
That's right.
Thank you. So that's great. Yeah, a 4-point Likert scale will bring me out in hives. I can imagine it's exactly the same for Hilary. So thanks, Hilary. That was really, really great. And lots of tips there. And now I'd like to introduce Mark from NIHR and Britta from Oxentia, who are going to take us into a little bit of a deeper dive on theory of change.
Love the music. Hi, everybody. We're going to do a bit of a double act here. So we're both going to be up here attempting to use the microphones and everything at about the same time. We might get the roving mics if we're having trouble. If you're having trouble hearing us. Here we've got the clicker, and we're up. So my name. Let's see if this works. There we go. There it is too. Got it. My name is Britta Wyatt. I'm with Oxentia Consulting and Training Company. I know many of you, I've met many of you that I'm seeing here at the conference, and you probably know of Oxentia through the services we offer universities around commercialization, business engagement, knowledge exchange. What you might not know is we also work with other kinds of organizations, funders, government agencies, corporates, foundations, supporting them in their offerings around innovation ecosystems, entrepreneurship programs, and other support. And so today, Mark and I are going to be talking about a pilot project that we worked on together, or we worked on with you at the NIHR to develop logic models for a series of their funding programs. So we're going to kind of build, where did Hilary go? There she is over there. So Hilary was talking a lot about kind of the how of the evaluation, and we're actually going to go step back and talk a little bit about not so much how you gather the data, but what data should you be gathering in the first place? And how do you know if your program, your intervention is likely to be a success? And one of the tools we can use to do that is logic modeling and theory of change. Do you want to introduce yourself now, or shall I wait till I get to your NIHR slide?
Either way. Can everyone hear me? Fine, thank you. I'm slightly suspicious about the microphone a little bit. Apologies for that.
Well, actually, your NIHR starts next, yes.
Okay, so a lot of you would have heard of NIHR, would have had some of our funding, but it's probably worth going a little into some detail about what NIHR is, what do we fund, how we governed, and why we thought logic models a few years ago before the pandemic were worth investing time and effort with. This is actually quite an old slide. It's been on the website for quite a while. I bring it up because the Chief Scientific Officer of NIHR, Department of Health, Lucy Chappell, spoke this slide at the NHS R&D Forum conference recently and said that it was so good when she came in, she didn't feel she needed to change it. And it is a very good exemplar of what NIHR does and why we take funding in the health and social care space so seriously. We fund for a number of broad reasons. We fund obviously for health and social care research, but we are interested in certain hot button topics, if I can use that particular term, underserved communities, the issues around multimorbidity, rather than any particular single capacity building event. We have quite a complicated governance structure. I would be quite happy over coffee or a drink to explain it in more detail, but quite simply we report the Chief Scientific Officer and the Science Research and Evidence Director at the Department of Health. As I said, that's Lucy Chappell at the moment. Hopefully many of you will remember Chris Whitty from those fantastic pandemic presses he used to do, and before that it was Sally Davis. But as I said, we are funding on behalf of the Department of Health. We fund over £1 billion a year, about 1.3 if I remember rightly. It's a very broad funding program. Some of our funding programs, like Research for Patient Benefit, will put in £50,000 to £60,000 looking at the effects of translating a patient reporting outcome measure into Gujarati, all the way to £100, £120 million infrastructure project between Oxford University Hospitals and Oxford University in terms of the Biomedical Research Centre programme. It's very, very broad, it's very, very deep, And by definition, that does cause some issues when it comes to looking at impact. Britta.
Right. So in 2019, the Department of Health and Social Care asked the coordinating centers at NIHR to create a series of logic models, essentially, right? With the goal of making sure that programs were evaluation ready and that we had better targeted metrics and indicators to evaluate the success of those. So the approach that we ended up taking, working with Mark and the team at NIHR, was to design a series of logic models for different programs through an iterative process and approach. What I'm going to do first is tell you a little bit about what logic models are, just in case people are not familiar with that, so we're all talking about it at the same level, and then we'll talk a little bit about the process that we use to design these with the programs and how that evolved and changed over time, how we kind of adapted the approach, and some tips and learnings that came up around the way. So what is a logic model? It's basically a visual way to show how a program is supposed to work, how an intervention or project is supposed to work. You can use them for different levels, whether that's a spin-out venture at a university, or a research project, or a funding program, or an entrepreneurship program, or even a university strategy. These can use at all different levels. What it is doing is representing the hypothesis or the theory of change for how that program, that investment, that intervention is going to affect change and make an effect on the world. It's split into two parts, the kind of work and things that you do, and the intended results on the right-hand side. And ultimately, all the way over on the right is the impact. And what we'll talk about later when we talk about the process is when you're building these models, you usually start with that. You start with what success look like, what's the impact we want to have, and how can we create a process, a workflow, and activities and outcomes and outputs and outcomes to achieve that. So why are we using logic models? Several reasons. It might be about strengthening your case for investment. I think Hillary actually touched on many of these as well. It could be about improving a program, being able to link what you're doing to the actual results that are being achieved, and also to inform evaluations. But particularly what we found was quite useful in this project was it was a mechanism to engage stakeholders. These could be stakeholders who have an invested interest in the outcome of the program. It might also be, for example, in the instance of the funding programs that we were doing these for, these could be tools that could be even used in communicating with potential awardees, with universities, et cetera, about the program and what it's actually about. And I think this is really important, this engagement with stakeholder point. One of the sessions earlier, Jane Kitson from the University of York was talking about how they had an internal board meeting to talk about knowledge exchange and commercialization and what the university really wanted at a strategic level to be the results of that. And they got the board around the table, gave them a list of things to pick from, and the top thing, by far on the top of their list, was about public good, he said. And I think that's really an interesting thing to think about is when you actually get your stakeholders together and you give them a framework for this conversation, what will they actually identify as the thing that's going to define success and be impactful for your program? So once you know that, that can change how you design the activities and the interventions that you run. So when do you use these? Again, it's similar to some of the stuff that Hillary said. It could be for program design. It could be actually when you're in the implementation phase of a program and you want to think about kind of what it is we need to do to continuously improve this, to feedback in the development of the program, or it could be at the evaluation stage of the program. I mentioned earlier that there's sort of a process you go through when you're designing a logic model. And it kind of starts with the right, which is, well, not right. It starts with kind of where are we at, what's the situation, and what's the impact that we intend to achieve. You think about questions like what's it going to look like when we get to that state? What do we actually envision as an outcome from this? What are the behaviors that need to change to get there? What enabling factors, knowledge or skills might we need? And then you get into the actual meat of it, which is, well, what are we actually going to do about it? What are the activities that this program, this project, et cetera, is involved in? And I think that's really interesting because often when we're thinking about a program or a project or design, even when we're working with researchers or commercialization projects, we tend to jump straight into the activity. What's the thing we're going to do? I mean, if you shift that thinking a little bit and think about what are we trying to get to, that can be quite quite interesting to see how it changes maybe the approach. We're seeing a lot of this as well in the space of knowledge exchange and commercialization when we have innovators or researchers who are more socially driven, interested in maybe social enterprises, for example, or other social ventures as a pathway forward. One of the things I'm seeing some of the universities do is sit down with them and help them create their own theory of change or logic model around that project, and that becomes something that then leads to an impact statement, a social good statement that can drive the business or other venture strategy forward. Right, so about the project. Back to you to talk about the pilot.
It is. Okay, so we're going to talk about the I4I program, which was the first funding program in our child that went through the logic model process. Breda will talk about what we did and what we learnt, and then we will wrap up about what we're doing today and how to go forward. So, can I ask, and the disco lights are blaring straight at me, so I'm going to do this. Has anyone got I4I funding at their institution? Okay, I think that's a 0. All right, this is unusual. Normally, at least a few people have got it, and they have war stories and scars on their back about it. The best way to describe the Invention for Innovation I4I program is it's a particular type of translational research funding. I like to describe it almost as quasi-venture capital, because the idea is to take a possible medical device, in vitro diagnostic, digital health technology, and take it the next step. Take it to that black box stage where a venture capitalist or business angel would want to actually put proper money in. A lot of the money goes to university hospital partnerships, but occasionally there is a small and medium-sized enterprise involved. And we sort of chose this as the pilot because it's later stage translational research. And in many ways, you can imagine the metrics of that form of funding easier to visualize and understand. There should be less argument. The more basic the research, potentially harder it is to visualize the impact of it. I don't think that's a controversial statement. So that's why we chose the I4I program.
So how did the project actually work? What you can see on this slide is this was actually a multi-step, multi-phase project that we worked on over several years. Why were we doing it this way? We wanted to come up with an efficient way to create logic models for, 20 or so different funding programs, right? And over these different 3 phases, we were using a feedback loop, a learning loop, in order to make sure that we were doing this in a way that was going to be both efficient, but also that had buy-in from the program managers and program directors that actually were managing these funding programs. Because ultimately, this isn't about a top-down approach. You must create a logic model. It's hopefully about creating something that's going to have use and value to the funding teams themselves, the program teams themselves. So we did it in a multi-step approach. Those acronyms that you see on the slide are the names.
It's important to hammer these points home about the questions you need to ask when it comes to setting up a theory of change or logic model. That first question, what is the current situation we intend to impact? It might sound like quite an obvious thing to say, but the number of times I've seen people try to create logic models based on what they think that program of funding was meant to do, not actually what it was set up to do. They don't go back to the original terms of reference, they don't interview those people on the funding panel, and therefore they start off at the wrong point. They start off looking at a different situation which that funding wasn't actually created to do. Let's take the I4I program. Because it's quasi-venture capital, a lot of people think, well, surely that's there to make lots and lots of money. So if it's not made lots and lots of money, there's no impact. But actually, that's not the point of I4I, is to move things to that black box stage, to make it more likely that venture capitalists will pick it up, as an example. So always thinking about what that current situation we're trying to impact. What the outcomes people actually want. The behaviors thing is massively important. We all have a set of unconscious biases, and they all interfere. So a theory of change logic model exercise needs to look at the behaviors that need to change and what knowledge and skills need to be developed to make those changes. The activities necessary for learning, again, these all may sound obvious things, but in our day jobs, because we're so busy, we work on annual cycles, we don't necessarily think deeply enough, and a theory of change logic model exercise can really help. And obviously, by definition, resource is important. NIHR is not the only funder. Money is not the only resource when it comes to these things. So we looked at a couple of, or actually 3 or 4 more programs afterwards, and I'm going to show a couple of slides about some of the stuff we got back from the workshops that we actually did. Now, the 2 programs up there are the AHSC, which is the Academic Health Science Centre program, and PGFR, which is Program Grants for Research. They are very different models of funding. In fact, Academic Health Science Centre has no funding at all, which is a very different funding model. Basically, university hospital partnerships compete for the validation, for the almost a trademark, by explaining how they will work longer term with NHS England and other bodies to change the health of the region and the nation. Programme grants for research is very much a traditional funding model. People apply for 3 to 5 years worth of funding, $500,000, 1-2 million. So they're very, very different. There were some common learning from the workshops across the piece, but basically they had different feedback mechanisms and different discussions that were important. So we had to be very clear in the stakeholder engagement workshops what logic models were. We had to explain them in a non-patronizing way, which you've got to be careful because some people do have a lot of knowledge about how these things work. Why we were bringing people together in the first place, setting expectations at those engagement workshops, what the aims of the sessions were. Going back to the what's the current situation, explaining what the funding program or what the model actually was that we were looking at. And there were common things that we learned coming up with the draft impact statements when it came to the activities, what the program aims were, what the misconceptions were. I thought was kind of interesting from that sort of work that came through. Britta.
Right. So we adapted the workshops a little bit based on kind of the needs of the program and actually where they were at in their thinking and their kind of understanding of their own impact that they wanted to achieve. We thought it'd be interesting to just show you an example of one of the ones that came out of this exercise. This was the Program Grants for Applied Research. And the way that this logic model ended up being developed, you can see it follows that flow of inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, impact. We have some assumptions and context on the bottom, and we have the program aims and purpose at the top. This is a very busy logic model, right? What we ended up doing with this group is they already had a draft to start with, and so it was about refining this and making it work for their stakeholders and audiences. We ended up putting kind of themes to cluster the elements of the audience, and we made a strategic decision, or this conscious decision, not to draw too many causal linkages between the activities because it was felt that that wasn't suitable for this audience. Now, what is this used for? Can you use this and put it in front of somebody and say, this is how the program works, now you understand everything? No, not necessarily. But can you use this for kind of wider alignment with stakeholders within the program team, even with other kind of external stakeholders? Yes, and that's kind of what they're using it for, I believe. Now, just to give an example of a different logic model coming out of the global health research, this is actually their theory of change. They've gone the vertical direction. They've shown all sorts of causal linkages between how it works, and they've done some kind of categorization by time. The point of putting these two up there is just to make the point that they don't all have to look the same. It's about thinking about the purpose of the model, what it needs to do and achieve for you and your organization or your program or your project. Next, over to you.
So NIHR have learned a lot from the logic model exercise. Virtually all the programs that I'm aware of now have their own logic model. They are part of what we do and what we look at when we're trying to work out the effect or potentially the impact of the research that we fund or the things that we override. There's a lot of work we've done training our staff to understand what logic models mean and making sure they're clear and concise as possible. There's also basically a program to make sure that they are renewed on a regular basis. They don't just sit on the shelf and get dusty. If we had more time, I'd be suggesting that we'd be playing the fantastic video that would go through the impact strategy of the NIHR. If anyone's interested, it is available on YouTube or directly on the NIHR web, but I think that within the time we have, that's probably not helpful right now. So, There are some tips and takeaways that I think we'd like to do in the final 6 minutes and 45 seconds according to my watch, but let's not quibble over the 45 seconds. So let's just go through them, if that's okay. So this is very important from a health and social care funder's perspective. Logic models should represent a shared understanding. You've got to be inclusive. What we learned from that original one with Eye for Eye that was internally focused is it was perfectly fine, but didn't necessarily have a broad enough outlook. And if you're using a logic model to try and work out what metrics or KPIs you use, the unconscious bias of people who work within a funder is going to be things we can count, things we can audit, things we can hit with a hammer. And yet, let's be blunt, a lot of the impact is going to be things which are going to be less tangible than that. And unless you have decent stakeholder engagement, it's not going to work. Keep the model alive. All these exercises are completely pointless if you just put them on the shelf. I know that's an obvious thing to say, but it's quite common that lots of time and effort is put in, and then that's basically it. So refer to the model, use it within the conversations that you have with your stakeholders. Don't overcomplicate things. Now, I appreciate the program grants for applied research impact model looked very heavy. It does on a screen like this, but actually it is quite self-explanatory when you look at it. But logic models should be used as part of your communication to the broader community. You should be able to point to them about why we do things. And always be upfront with and use the model to test your assumptions. Bias, bias, bias. I mean, it is a real issue in our field. And a properly done and refreshed and kept alive logic model will always retest the assumptions. Let's see. My eyesight's not that good. So just some very quick things to avoid. It's not the end point. They do have a sell-by date, but they can be reflected. It's a collection of people's opinions. It's not quantitative in that sense. It's qualitative. For those who want to audit, logic models aren't necessarily helpful. It can come up with KPIs which are number-driven, but it's not about number weighing itself. And the theory of change can help get the bricks into place about broader engagement issues, which I think are important for research funders and research institutions. And I'll keep saying this, whether you're doing impact assessment or not, I still use them. I've now retired from impact. I work on strategic partnerships, but I still use logic models in many ways to engage with people. I'm doing a piece of faith-based research engagement. That'll be based on the theory of change and logic models as a way of bringing the stakeholders together. And finally, for me, before I hand back to Britta, there are some fantastic resources online. The best one is the Theory of Change free course. So those of you who've done the Theory of Change, that's fantastic. Those of you who haven't, that course on OpenEdu is absolutely brilliant. It takes about 2 hours, and we'll just do all the A's and B's of what you need to think about when coming up with this sort of stuff. Britta, I think the last slide is yours.
Yep. If you don't want a free course, Auxentia, no. Auxentia, well, this is not so much the kind of theory of it. This is actually a workshop. So if you are interested in doing a workshop where you can either bring your own project or work on a case, we're going to be trialing out a new in-person, not virtual, workshop in Oxford at the end of July. We decided to go in person because we felt with something like this, it has so much value when you can do it in a face-to-face setting, interacting in a group environment. So if you are interested, there's a QR code there, or come talk to me at the Auxentia stand, and happy to chat more. And that's that it. It is. And we have time for one question, apparently. Oh, there's one over there.
And there's one there. Surely we can fit two in if we're quick. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much. I guess as a first question really might just be semantics, but do you see there's a difference between a theory of change and a logic model, or do you kind of use them interchangeably? Because I've used both but I haven't used them at the same time, for instance, but I think there was something that you might have alluded to at the start, Britta, but I just want a clarification on that. And then there was a very quick follow-up question as well. You said when you were doing a theory of change, it's best to do it project by project, do you then assimilate those different theories of change into one theory of change, or do you have a theory of change for each of your different projects?
So theory of change can be done without producing a logic model. You don't need a logic model. Logic model is just a visualization of the theory of change. It's very useful when it comes to dealing with a broad range of stakeholders. So you can do one without the, well, you can't do a logic model without the theory of change, but you can do the theory of change without a logic model. Project by project and then bringing them together is one way of doing it. It is difficult by definition. So with the Academic Health Science Centre, the no money funding model, all the academic health science centres are meant to have their own individual logic model. And they were helpful when we were building up a program broad one or program wide one. But the difficulty there is not getting to a situation where you have to come up with averages of what those statements means, and therefore those statements become meaningless. So there is a danger there, but it can be done.
Mm-hmm. There was one other question over here. I don't know if we have time for that.
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly to piggyback on Kelly's question. You mentioned it's not a collection of people's opinion, but do you think there's a case where it's actually useful to separate the outcomes based on the stakeholders engaged in the activity or project? And no, that's going to be it.
Yeah, it depends on the funding program. And the point about keeping them alive is even if you make, okay, step back, the best is the enemy of the good. Coming up with the perfect logic model will probably drive you insane. So come up with something that works and review it on a regular basis, and those things will pop out. Those original assumptions, when tested, proved not to be true. Those stakeholders were not representative. It needs to change. So the key thing is not, are you going to get it right first time? You're not, by the way. It's making sure that you have regular reviews in the cycle to make sure it is still relevant and fresh.
Thanks.
Okay.
My shepherd's crook. So that's, thank you. Oh. Thanks, Mark and Britta, for that really useful insight into logic models and theory of change. And I have some tips, and if I've picked up some tips, and if I have time at the end, I will. Oh gosh, there's me. It's giant. That's horrible. Don't look behind you. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to get off the stage and invite Maria from the Kingston School of Art to come and focus down a little bit more on a case study of an evaluation that she's done.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I can see the slides okay, relatively, because my eyesight is not great. I just need to put this here, if that's okay. So, thank you. And yes, my name is Maria Katzikristodoulou. I'm a professor at Kingston University, and I'm also the Associate Dean for Research, Business and Innovation at Kingston School of Art. So I will narrow down and I will offer here a case study of a particular project and the evaluation approach we used in that project. So it is not a strategic university level approach, it's very much a single project approach. But perhaps if we have time, we can reflect on what this might mean, how might we transfer those approaches and issues to a wider kind of more strategic university context as well, or institutional context. So the presentation is about evaluating knowledge exchange with underserved communities, and I'll give you a bit of a context for the project before I go on to talk a bit about how we work to evaluate the project. So the project is called Asset-Based Storytelling in Kingston, and it was a project led by Kingston Libraries, which is part of the Royal Borough of Kingston. We have 9 libraries in Kingston, 7 physical libraries, 1 digital and 1 community library, as well as an archive. And so we worked with the head of libraries and the Royal Borough. We also worked with a storyteller named Richard Neville, and the project took place last year between 21 and 22, just over a year, and it was funded by Art Council England. We worked with 7 community organisations in the borough, so it did take part pretty much across the whole borough of Kingston. And here you can see the charities that we worked with. Mind Mencap, Voices of Hope, Kingston Church's Action on Homelessness, Refugee Action Kingston, Hestia and Balance. So the kinds of communities that we worked with were communities with severe physical and learning disabilities, people with mental health issues, people with who were homeless and had issues around addiction and abuse, women victims of domestic abuse, and also refugees and people who were displaced. So quite a wide range of different communities that we worked with through the project. So the project involved collaborative storytelling sessions led by our storyteller, Richard Neville, who is amazing. And we delivered between 6 and 14 sessions to each partner organization. So it was just under 80 co-designed community storytelling sessions that we delivered over that 1 year. And then we also did another whole level of work in bringing together the 7 charities that we were our partners in the project to exchange and to co-design a toolkit, a storytelling toolkit, as well as to develop a showcase for the outcomes of the project, because part of the purpose of the project was to bring those voices, to make those voices and people and stories more visible. So we wanted to engage audiences in the development of their own storytelling practice, enable them to extend their social networks, develop creative partnerships, enhance well-being, and increase access to culture. And just to say, the illustrations aren't random. They actually were created as part of the storytelling. And some of the communities we worked with had limited access to language for different reasons, either English language or non-verbal communities, and so we used a lot of visual storytelling methods as well. So we took an asset-based approach through which we wanted to curate community assets within the Borough, such as obviously public libraries as assets, as well as encourage users and partner organizations to consider themselves and each other as assets. And actually we were really quite struck at the first workshop where we brought all the charities together to realize that they had never done that before, and they don't actually work together, even for charities such as Mind and Mencap, for example, but might have quite similar purposes and might be supporting similar types of communities. So, did it move? Yes, it did, yeah. So, the project was designed with Kingston Libraries, as I said, and part of the purpose, again, was for the Kingston Libraries wanted to, and still do want, to completely transform themselves as a public asset and as a community resource, and to become much more than libraries, so than places where you go to kind of borrow a book, but to become kind of community hubs. And so the whole project was about supporting the library's vision to transform into community hubs. And this is a vision that is shared across many public libraries, across many parts of the country. And they use different terms. They might use community hubs or neighborhood hubs or other kinds of terminologies, but it is a shared vision across public libraries. And so our role in the project as Kingston School of Art, and I was leading on that, working with a research assistant, Dr. Alex Laffer, was to lead on as independent evaluators and also to co-design with the partners a toolkit for asset-based storytelling in the community for community development. So the purpose of the toolkit is to make the project sustainable going forward. So, sorry, I should have been seeing that, and now you're seeing the correct slide. Okay. So some of the characteristics of the project, which I guess would be characteristics for many projects that are with underserved communities and what we might in the past had called hard to reach communities. First of all, the project was very collaborative in its approach. So it was all about working with the charities and working with the users or participants. It was adaptive to the needs of those particular communities. So we had some ideas beforehand, and when we went to the Art Council to ask for funding about what we wanted to do, but those were not fixed in stone, and actually it changed a huge amount during the process of delivery to respond to the needs of the communities and what they were telling us they wanted to do. And just as an example, doing the storytelling sessions with the refugee communities, their priority was to learn English. And we hadn't considered, but the purpose of our storytelling would be about actually language learning. We were thinking about other things, but it became more about learning English as a foreign language. So we were very responsive to the particular needs. It was all co-designed, so the storytelling and the toolkit was all co-designed, and so obviously that means that we didn't know in advance what the outcome was going to be. And it was very, very dynamic as a project, responsive to the need, as I said, but also to the moment. So another example, working with the homeless communities, quite often we had, booked spaces, we had a plan for the session, and people quite often would be obviously in crisis, it's very difficult circumstances. So we'd end up, for example, doing the session perched on a wall outside the local church. So really a kind of working on our toes, as anybody who has done community youth work will know and have experienced as well. We also wanted to be inclusive of existing narrative practices. So obviously, working with such a diverse range of communities, they bring a wealth of knowledge and their own ways of approaching stories, of understanding of what a story is. So we wanted to incorporate that. And we used a really very wide range of activities for storytelling. As I said before, some of our communities did not have English language or were non-verbal. So we used oral storytelling, we used puppetry, we used life narrative, so autobiographical storytelling, creative writing approaches, literary games, you name it. We used nature, actually, I forgot to put in here. So we had some garden visits where we kind of used nature as our stimulus for storytelling. So some of the challenges in evaluating that kind of activity are probably quite obvious. First of all, the participatory nature of the activity presents some challenges for the evaluators. The fact that it is process-based, and so the focus is on the process itself, not on the outcome. And the fact that it is co-designed, and so it's very difficult to know in advance what you expect, what the outcomes should be before you actually do those co-design sessions with the communities which are part of the project. And then working with vulnerable and volatile participants is always, can be quite challenging for the storyteller and for the evaluator as well. Obviously, a lot of ethical questions there. We went through ethics approval and so on. But those can be quite sensitive situations. And we did have, a few sessions where the various types of crises unfolded in the sessions. And everything can change at any, at any point, all the time. So, sorry, I'm trying to change two sets of slides at once. There we go. So, obviously, I am talking here about public and community engagement activity, primarily, and we have quite a range of existing evaluation frameworks for that. And I have worked, before I went into an academic career quite a long time ago, I worked as a community participation officer, so we were using different types of approaches to evaluate our work. We have resources today through the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, and if you go on the website, it's got a range of evaluation resources, and then there's lots of other organizations, as colleagues before mentioned, that provide resources, and those include universities, such as UCL's Public Engagement Unit, various foundations, such as the New Economics Foundation, research councils, the Art Council itself, of course, and also various charities. And of course, there's an extensive bibliography, and already colleagues have touched on those. So our leading framework in that context was to deliver an empowerment evaluation. And that is a type of evaluation that provides organizations with a tool and knowledge to allow them to improve their programs through self-evaluation and reflection. So our aim was to work with the libraries and with the charities, all our partners, to help them reflect and self-evaluate in terms of how the project was for them, whether they met their objectives for the project. We often served as a coach or an additional facilitator in the sessions, and actually it's worth saying, the colleague from Exeter talked about the cost of evaluation before. It's worth saying that I said we offered about just under 80 storytelling sessions plus additional workshops for the toolkit, and we were present in about 60 of those 80 sessions as evaluators. So the time investment was huge. It is also worth saying that the sessions were in the charities spaces, so we wanted the users to be comfortable in their particular environments, and we wanted to gradually bring them onto the libraries and other resources and assets in the borough so that they could start feeling comfortable to access those resources. And so it involved a lot of moving around in different types of environments in different parts of the borough. So project staff and participants in that context are involved through facilitated dialogues and discussions in articulating the program, setting priorities, and determining the measures and the evidence needed to monitor its success. And I just said about the huge time investment required. So our approach was very dynamic. It was a dynamic evaluation style to suit the project's adaptive and responsive delivery style. And we did use theory of change, which I love, and I'll say just a couple of things about that because we already had a really good deep dive into that. So we took what we called an inside-outside evaluation approach, where we were the external evaluation partner, but we also were, as I said before, acted as coaches on the program, and where we were very much part of the project. A critical participant, if you like, in almost all of the sessions. We did the needs analysis and used the theory of change model, and I'll show it in a minute. We used a lot of creative methods in our evaluation sessions. So that was a storytelling project. So actually we used storytelling as a method of evaluating the outcomes and the impact of the project. That's because obviously working with people that we wanted to be very sensitive and careful about how we were going about evaluating it. We did not want to overwhelm participants, and we wanted the evaluation to feel really embedded in the project and really a very coherent and integral part of it. So a lot of self-evaluation and reflection and 360 feedback, as the colleagues previously said. It was really important to hear from all different stakeholders. So library staff, library volunteers, charity staff, volunteers, leaders, the participants themselves, obviously, from all the charities, as well as the storyteller. And there wasn't any easy box ticking in that process. So kind of good, bad, those polarized notions weren't really relevant in the context here. So I will just show you briefly our theory of change model, which has dropped onto the practice already slide. So you can see it is quite a busy theory of change. But we find it is very much a working document for us. We used it to develop, monitor, and evaluate the project, and we found it extremely useful. And I have done previously some consultancy work with local authorities, etc., to evaluate projects, and I do often, always probably use theory of change, because I agree it is a really, really effective model for all the ways that you, Britta and Mark, said before. For all the reasons, rather. So very briefly, what were the advantages for us in using theory of change? It is a planning mechanism as well as an evaluation mechanism. So you kind of, I really love the fact that you start from the point of the impact that you want to achieve to work your way backwards and plan what kinds of activities you need to design to achieve that desirable impact. The monitoring and the evaluation become embedded in the planning process, so we're not stuck at the end. We didn't just come at the end to say, oh, you did well, that was a good project. We were very much an integral part of the whole process, and it's a holistic approach. So it focuses on the links between activities and impacts, kind of visualizing those relationships as you heard before, but also it explores the contexts, other related programs, the potential unintended results of the program, things such as our assumptions, participant engagement mechanisms, and also looks at issues of sustainability and legacy of the program as well. And finally, almost finally, the advantages of using creative methods in evaluation process. And I know that it's interesting, but with us, impact is becoming more and more important in research. I'm asked, for example, by our impact office at the university to talk about creative methods and why they're good and how can we use them to achieve more impact. And I do that, and I am a really big advocate of using creative methods in research and in evaluative processes for a number of reasons. And I've got some quotes there from a project, a European funded project called RICOMS. I believe that creative methods can support really transformative practices. They also support inclusive engagements, so where other types of participants and users their voices perhaps wouldn't be heard through a kind of more standard evaluation approach, such as a survey or a questionnaire, straight away that would be alienating for most of the participants, communities that we worked with on this project. Creative methods are inclusive and can involve everybody. They can spark disruptive ideas through lateral thinking and radical speculation, and they can evoke mental models by highlighting metaphors and narratives, and that are really importantly are aligned with people's deepest values. So a values-driven approach rather than perhaps a more KPI-driven approach. And coming from the arts and humanities, I really appreciate that. So that's just a bit of a cheesy picture of us there holding all the community charities published booklets with the outcomes of the project, and the participants were very pleased about that. This is an event in the main library at Kingston with the mayor and the kind of deputy mayor, etc. And importantly, the next steps for us. Firstly, we have just won some AHSC funding through the Technic Consortium, and we have a joint scholarship with now the head of Camden Libraries, was previously the head of Kingston Libraries, to develop that project in Camden and look specifically at health and well-being benefits for using storytelling in libraries. We're also applying for more Art Council funding to run the project in a different way in Camden, working with all the Camden libraries, 14 of them. And we are developing bigger bids both for Art Council and research funding to research the benefits of using storytelling in this way for community development and well-being, and particularly asset-based storytelling approaches, and also to scale up the project in more libraries in London and across the country. And from having done presentations in various library networks, we were really pleased that we got really positive feedback and interest. So we want all libraries really to become community story hubs. And let's hope that might happen in the future. So that's me. Thank you very much. I don't know how much time I took, but hopefully, excellent. Thank you.
Hiya. I was really interested in hearing a bit more, maybe an example of how you built the evaluation process, a creative evaluation process, into a storytelling session, and then also how you then work backwards, taking those results and putting them into a more traditional model of evaluation that might be required by Arts Council England, for example.
So we built a storytelling evaluation session into every set of sessions delivered with every partner. And as I said, these really range. So the minimum was 6 plus 1 evaluation. The maximum was 14, and it was very much on the group of whether they wanted to go on with it, have additional sessions. So the last one was always around looking back and around the impact of the storytelling and what they got out of it. But we did that through storytelling, using some of the ways the methods of storytelling we used in the project per se. So, for example, in working with Voices of Hope, which is a charity working with women victims of domestic abuse in Kingston, the evaluation came in the form of a poem that the group collectively wrote about the impact this had on them, the transformative impact it had on them. A lot of the outcomes came in the form of drawings or of personal narratives or of stories written, but we then published in the books. So it was also kind of really interesting to consider how we present this material, as you said, to the funder. So obviously we did submit a normal standard evaluation report to the Art Council. We included quotes, but also we had a lot of evidence in 7 booklets printed with all that information that was verbatim. And obviously there's ethical questions around how you use that type of material that you generate from communities such as the ones that we were working with. I don't think the funder had any concerns about that. So I think they found, we got really positive feedback. The Art Council encouraged us to apply for further funding and for bigger funding, and they could really see the evidence of the value that the project brought to the communities. But I think it's a really good question, because obviously everybody's really scared when you talk about creative methods, particularly in evaluation. And it's that question of creative versus, can creative ever be robust enough so that the funders kind of accept that as an equally robust evaluation method. And it's not to say that we did not use, we didn't have as any quantitative metrics as well. So we did have numbers of participants and everything else that you'd expect as well.
Yeah, just what difference for the participants themselves?
What difference the project made to the participants? So obviously it's a whole range of participants we worked with, and it made very different difference to different types of participants. Some people did say that it was transformative for them. So we had a woman who worked in our female victims of domestic abuse group, who then decided to apply to university for creative writing course, and she gave us a kind of a narrative about the impact it had on her personally and how it transformed her life. So we had kind of really amazing feedback from some people. We had other people who had really struggled to engage. So from some groups we had quite small number of participants that stayed till the end, but we thought generally with community engagement work, I always think that the numbers just tell part of the story. So the quality of the impact you can have on 2 or 3 people's lives, is really significant in that type of project. So I can't give you one answer, but I think there was a range of different impacts, and that came through the personal narratives and the different types of responses we got. Confidence building and was a lot what we wanted to achieve was confidence building and community building, and that sense that people have the confidence to access the assets in their communities. And we saw some evidence of that with people visiting the libraries, feeling that their voices were being heard within the context of their communities, wanting to continue to develop this work, and charities coming together to continue their work and using stories in their practice going forward. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria. That was brilliant. Thanks. So, I don't know about you, but I've picked up lots of hints and tips. I will really quickly try to assimilate them. So, number one, always make sure your Likert scales are balanced. Cost for evaluation when you are putting in for bids. It takes time, it takes skill, and it does take money. The other thing is logic models and theories of change are living documents. Love them, look at them, review them frequently. You're never going to make a perfect one, so don't panic. Just because something's hard to evaluate doesn't mean it can't be evaluated, and that's the time to get creative. Make sure you involve your stakeholders as early as possible. Diverse voices are really important. And finally, my favourite point was logic models, it's not number one. So, thank you to our brilliant panellists for a great session. I hope you've all picked up something as exciting as I have, and I'm going to get chucked